Well, we're at 11:25, so time to resume. Some feedback on what happened in the intervening period, Mr. Linus.
So I'm happy to take this. I've had a helpful discussion with Mr. Manley as always. A couple of points, please. First of all, to just emphasise, we have actually been speaking to the university already. We have some queries that we have sent to them, I think, fairly recently, which we're expecting a reply on. We understand that a reply will be forthcoming, we think, in the next 10 days or so, and that will kick-start further discussions on the Statement of Common Ground. There is a draft that is with us. Work is progressing on that, and it will continue. And what we'd envisaged is that once we'd received the answers to the questions that we have put, that work would continue on the Statement of Common Ground in line with that being finalised alongside the preparation of any hearing statements for the next phase on site-specific matters, so that areas of common ground will be set out in that document, and any areas of disagreement were identified in the same document and then covered in the hearing statements of the respective parties. And we'd use the timetable for the hearing statements effectively as a long stop date for discussions that are going to proceed. As far as the discussions are concerned, I mean, I think I have to emphasise the crucial issue is the evidence base for the land take that the university is wanting. As you'll have seen, the council has been asking questions of the university about the evidence base to justify what it's wanting, and we see that as a critical issue to be taken forward through the discussions, because we're not satisfied. We're not satisfied that we've seen that yet, but rather than get into the detail of that now, hopefully the timetable that we've agreed with the university will allow those matters to be explored, and as I said, we will do that. The council will facilitate those meetings according to that timetable.
Thank you, that's helpful. Mr. Manley, was there anything you wanted to say?
For a reflection of the agreements, yes. And at least it means when we get to the site specifics, then there will be a full suite of evidence. I suppose the period of time set aside for that site specific and so on will be governed to some extent by where we've got up to and what is and what isn't outstanding in your own view of how long that will take. But there's no reason at all in principle that all those matters can't be dealt with in one session.
Just before we move on from questions about the university, so our understanding, and do correct us if we've got this wrong, is the 650 figure does not include economic growth at or as a result of the university. Is that right, or have I got that wrong?
I think it doesn't account for growth at the university, but the growth as a consequence of the university is very much part of the economic strategy that I described previously. If you look at that economic strategy, it has as one of its 8 essential to-dos, drive real university and business-led and university and research-led business growth in key sectors, and then that's translated into one of its long-term targets for priority high-value sector growth at least 20% faster than predicted. And as I've described earlier, that's actually what's then driven the model, which has then forecast the job numbers. So the spin-off, the induced impact in the economy is included in that, but there's a separate policy for. Well, I'll leave the allocation to my planning colleagues.
So the 650 figure, as a matter of fact, does show lower growth in the university. And as we started to discuss, the 650 figure does show lower HEFE growth as calculated. As set out in our 2017 Employment Land Review update, we acknowledge and test that there is, well, we've seen a level of consistency around the total level of growth within sort of a range, not dropping below 400 on baseline, not exceeding 610. From the OE forecast, there are those sectoral shifts in jobs when that model was run, and that's picked up in our evidence as well. So on the point of the university, our supply response to the university is not rigidly driven by that sectoral split, hence having the ST27 allocation in response to that engagement from the university.
So I just want to make sure that I've understood the simple sort of fundamental point. I think what you're telling me is that it doesn't include growth. Sorry, it does include growth as a result of the university's various activities, but it does not include growth in job numbers at the university. Is that right?
That's right, but our local plan response does acknowledge the growth in the university through the allocation of site ST27.
I'm going to regret asking this. I'll just put it down as a marker, I think, for tomorrow, whether or not the exclusion of growth at the university from the 650 figure is an issue for the OAN in relation to housing. So if you can, I'm sure you've thought about it a lot already, but if you haven't, you have overnight to think about that. And I don't want to take any comments on that today.
Marker noted, sir.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Manley?
No, nothing else. I'm going to leave now, and Mrs. O'Neill, on my left, is going to stay for the rest of the day. She'll be here tomorrow as well, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We did say we were going to come to Ms. Cook next, didn't we? So, if you'll forgive me.
Thank you very
Ms.
much.
Cook.
You asked at the beginning the question about whether this was a target or a requirement, and you followed it up by a question along the lines of, you know, what does it matter if it is or isn't achieved? And our position is that one of the things that the Council has singularly failed to do is to stand back and ask themselves, are the forecasts realistic? Where is the reconciliation between the forecasts and what has been happening on the ground in York? And we draw attention to the fact that compared to the 650 forecast, the actual jobs that are being achieved on the ground are considerably more. And in 2.11 of our matter statement for today, we refer to the period 2009 to 2019 and a jobs figure of 1,100 per year, and the period 2014 to 2019 and a figure of 1,200. These are jobs being achieved per year, all jobs. And more recently, in between 2015 and 2020, 1,400 jobs per year. These are average figures within these periods. So the period of the three data sets I've given you, one of them is a 10-year period, which ends in 2019, and the 2015-2020 period suggests that despite Mr. Corsier's doom and gloom, actually what is happening in York bucks that trend. Can we also draw attention to 2.29 of our matter statement, which quotes from the City's Economic and Strategy Policy and Scrutiny Committee of July last year. There continues to be strong demand for industrial space. Di-da, di-da, di-da. So it's as if one arm of the city is not talking to the plan-making arm. And the real danger here is not that 650 isn't going to be achieved. It's more than being achieved, and it's been more than being achieved for several years. The real question is, what are the adverse consequences of not planning for this job growth properly? Answer: commuting. Thank you.
So I'll ask Mr. Brereton to deal with the point about the figures. I'll do no more than note that, as is often the case at local plans, we have one party saying we're not being realistic because we've over-egged the figure, another party saying we're not being realistic because we've massively under-egged it. And stepping aside from all the analysis, it tends to confirm the point that what the council has been trying to do is to strike a balance between competing considerations. But I can ask Mr. Brereton to deal with the specific figure about the specific points that are being made about how York is performing and how those should translate into what happens for a longer term forecast in this case.
Thank you. Yeah, as I highlighted earlier, the average growth over 10 years depends on which 10 years you look at. If you take the period 2008 to 2018, that's translated to 235 jobs a year, and the 20 years to 2018, 1998 to 2018 gives you 585 jobs a year. So I say it just highlights the need to really look at long-term trends here, and overall we're convinced that actually what we've been working on is basis.
Yes, I think as well, just to reiterate a point that Mr. Brereton made previously, it's not simply about historic trends that have taken place over a shorter time scale. There's other elements of forecasting involved, which is where the Oxford Economics work comes back in.
The forecasting period that you rely on includes, unless I'm mistaken, years that have already occurred. So does the council know what's actually happened in those years, and has that had any influence on your sense checking and sensitivity testing?
What I think we can say is that for when we reforecast last, I have to ask Sarah to remind me what date we're talking about. But when we've redone the forecast, we've taken into account extra delivery and the changes in terms of the jobs that have been delivered.
Sir, if it helps, the 2019 economic outlook does have information about years where data is available and set those against the years of forecast as well. So page 19 of EXCYC 29. So the Oxford Economics work did recognise that there was data available for years, and that's in figure 13, and then the commentary on page 19. And one must take that information alongside what Mr. Brereton has just said about how one interprets survey-based information such as that which is included on page 13, on page 19.
My apologies, Mr. Lyons. Could you? It might be because your microphone's to the side of you. You need to be a bit closer to it, unfortunately, I think.
Okay, is that better, sir? It feels louder. Okay. Yes, page 19 of EXCYC 29 includes information about years where data is available, and it sets that up alongside years of forecast on page 19. And one must bear in mind as well that one must align that information on page 19 with what Mr. Brereton has said about the reliability of looking at survey-based work on how jobs growth has actually occurred over different time periods.
I'd also say that the forecasts, of course, included the year just gone and the year just before, when we've gone through COVID, whereas has already been noted, basically we didn't see any job growth at all. So there are areas where it's gone up, there are areas where it's gone down. We don't think it affects the overall forecast.
I suppose what I'm asking is, look, you know, you're saying 650 jobs per annum from 2017 to 2033. That's the basis of the plan, isn't it? Well, presumably, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but presumably we know what the annual jobs growth has been from 2017 until now. What I'm asking is, has that been considered through the sensitivity testing stroke sense checking?
Yes, sir. The 650 jobs figure is an average target over the period. As set out in the hearing statements that we've submitted, and referenced, I think, in the period of data that was being referred to, linked to the economic strategy by Ms. Cook, shows higher growth in the earlier parts of the planned period and that growth levelling off. Again, that's set out in our statement.
You said higher earlier in the plan period. That those are the years that those are the years that have already happened. Is it?
So I'm just pulling up the figures for the years that have actually happened.
It's not quite as simple as that, is it? It depends on when the last statistics were published rather than what year we're in. So that would need a little bit of thought, which I'm not comfortable doing on the fly here in front of you.
The point I was making was about the general trend in the forecasts, which show earlier strong growth and then that growth levelling off. But as to the specific details, we can certainly bring that back to you in a note, if that would be helpful.
Perhaps if you turn up figure 13 in the York Economic Outlook 2019, and I've just got that in front of me, and I'd appreciate if you could perhaps talk me through that. I accept it might take you a little while to find it.
Yeah, so figure 13 is followed by a commentary on figure 13, which shows that according to BRES data, which is not the same data, BRES data is the Business Register and Employment Survey that's published by ONS. It's a count of the number of people who work for businesses in York, rather than an account of the number of people in York who are employed or self-employed, and is therefore, well, it doesn't, you know, so it's the BRES figures are agnostic in terms of where the person that's doing the job lives, and don't include people who aren't working for registered companies. So with that and that is part of the challenge in terms of forecasting employment numbers, is that there are various statistics published which don't directly correlate to each other. At a macro UK level, they kind of work, but at a local level, there are quite big discrepancies. But if you look at the BRES data, the number of people employed by businesses based in York has gone up higher than was expected since 2015. and averaged over that. And what that table is saying is that it was averaging 1,110 jobs per annum over that period. So that takes us up to, so there was stronger growth in that period, and as we've said, the way that 650 is derived is not from saying we must achieve 650 jobs each year. It's saying that over the planned period, the anticipated growth in jobs equates to 650 jobs a year. How that's distributed across those years, it won't be linear, because that's just not the nature of development and economic growth. So it was higher over that period, 2015 to 2018. I say it's also been significantly lower over the last 2 years because we've just been through the COVID pandemic where we've essentially seen zero growth. We still believe that it will balance out over the whole period to meet something close to that original forecast.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, what you're saying there might have been relatively strong growth in the early part of the planned period, so 17, 18, 18, 19, but over the whole planned period, your expectation is that it would average out at 650.
Yeah, and indeed, if you included the 2 years we've been to on top of the data we've just looked at, it would bring down the jobs per year by about 40%, because you've added an extra 2 years onto that period. That's how the statistics work. I understand that.
I mean, go on, Simon.
So does that mean from where we are sitting today, some point into the plan period, that from here on in, the plan is in fact planning for a reduction in growth from its current level?
No, I mean, no, because the last 2 years are in themselves exceptional. So we believe that all the forecasts are that we're actually in a V-shaped COVID-induced recession. Oxford Economics are expecting things to return.
Sorry, my apologies in saying current level. That probably wasn't the best choice of words, but the level that has been seen from 2017 before we hit, zero growth, as you put it, in relation to the pandemic.
Yes, because as I say, we're not kind of ticking off 650 jobs each year. We're looking at the whole of the growth over the whole of the period. So those were particularly strong years within that. Trying to think of specific developments that happened in that period, but it comes down to which company is expanding where, and we think that overall within the economy that will result in those longer term forecasts being reasonably accurate.
So you're relying on that expectation that over the planned period things will even out, if I can put it like that, along the line of 650. That would deal with Ms. Cook's point about the possibility of not undershooting, but in fact consistently overshooting. You're not expecting that?
Well, the last forecast that we looked at, which were, 4 or 5 months ago, the 2021 figures that have been referred to, which are beginning to look at the recovery of the economy after the COVID period, are actually in line with our forecast. So we think in terms of our sensitivity analysis, we're comfortable that they don't suggest that we're massively wrong in terms of the forecast that the plan is based on.
Ms. Cook, was there anything you wanted to say in response?
Yes, please, if I may. I'd like to just give you the reference to 2.13 of our matter statement, where we make a number of points about the CYC/29 document, which is the OE forecast. in November 2019. And I would, on a lighter note, encourage you to read the beginning of that, because it's quite amusing, because it was just before the general election and they predicted Boris's re-election, and it's quite entertaining. I found it quite entertaining for a moment anyway. But we make a number of points about effectively how that forecast is not it wasn't an update of the 2017 Employment Land Review. It was just a forecast, and there was no attempt in that document, nor have we seen any Employment Land Review further update, no attempt at sort of reconciling what has happened with the 650 projections. And you have today an updated table in the council's evidence base, an updated, they call it Table 1, which confusingly is an update to Table 4.1 in the plan. When Table 4.1 was produced, the source of that is the Employment Land Review 2017. And there's a table in there, Table 4, and that table looked to see what floor space had been gained, what floor space had been lost between 2012 and 2017. And what the council has not done is produce an update to that table, or indeed the Employment Land Review update, to just further cross-check what has been gained, what has been lost, to ask themselves, is this now very much average 650 jobs target, is that actually real in the context of York? You know, OE national forecasting is one thing, but you do then have to stop, pause, and look at what's actually happening in your city, because bear in mind, when Oxford Economics were doing their forecasts, there was no York Central. You know, that's a massive scheme which is going to generate a lot of jobs. We've already heard about the university and their expanding jobs, and we know, it seems, that is not adequately reflected in the OE forecast. So it just seems that the council has not stopped and paused and updated the Employment Land Review forecasts. And you might say, well, so what? But the really frightening thing is, and we'll get to this tomorrow, what they're using their employment-led figures for when it comes to housing.
Mr. Linus?
Just a couple of brief points. I think it's partly repeating what's happened before. I mean, the point about the paragraphs in the hearing statement, I think we've largely covered, because really what's being said there is that we haven't taken into account the figures relating to York's performance over the last few years, and we've dealt with that already. As far as the updating is concerned, we don't accept that there should have been a whole-scale review or entire repeat in the way that appears to have been suggested by Ms. Cook. What we did was conduct an employment land review in 2016, do a sensitivity test on that in 2017, and then reviewed through the 2019 and now the 2021 work whether there was a significant shift in what was going on, particularly with the baseline, to justify a major departure from what we did in 2016, and we reached the judgment perfectly soundly, we say, that there wasn't any significant change to require the fundamentals of the analysis to alter. As far as other updating is concerned, we have actually sought to update what was in Table 4.1 of the earlier Employment Land Review work, because we have taken into account changes in supply since the 2017 work and reflected those in Table 1, including the loss of office floor space. So we don't accept that we've failed to update to take into account changes of circumstances in supply on the ground. That's been done through the hearing statement.
Ms. Cook, do we need to prolong this further, or is there anything else you wanted to say?
Not at this moment, thank you.
Thank you. Good. I'll come to the other side of the room. Mr. Robinson, did you want to? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, only some minor points, but building on what's just been discussed, I think. If the figures included in the plan, the 650 figure, is a forecast or a target or an aspiration, rather than a more secure or more strict requirement, can that be effectively monitored? Were it adopted and the plan to be adopted and brought in, could it be effectively monitored throughout the plan period? Would the feedback be meaningful? Would the council have an appropriate means to reflect and review the policy that's in place if it's not a hard and fast requirement, if it's something a bit looser? And then perhaps linked to that, yesterday we discussed whether there's a need to aim for an almost immediate review of the local plan if it were to be adopted, based on various issues. But given the age of the evidence and the modelling, and I appreciate it's been sense tested in the interim, if it's not going to be fully reviewed and evidence restarted, then an immediate review, it gives further credence to the discussion yesterday about the need for a fairly immediate review if the plan were adopted. Thanks.
Mr. Linus?
Sir, the point about monitoring has already been picked up in the draft plan. That section or chapter 15 already includes monitoring targets. Page 245 relates to EC1 and the targets, the provision of sufficient employment, land and development to provide 650 additional jobs. So we say broadly that there is monitoring which the local plan would put in place to achieve sufficient land to deliver the 650 additional jobs per annum. As for the question of review, I think it's really repeating what was said yesterday. We don't see the case for anything formal going into the plan by way of a policy which is prescriptive about the timing for any review. There is a statutory obligation to conduct a review, and that would have to take into account guidance on when there's been changes of circumstance and monitoring and so on in the normal way. So we don't see there needs to be a specific policy addition to cover that. It would be covered in the normal course of events through the monitoring that the plan would provide for.
Thank you. Mr. Chapman?
Thank you. It's just, I don't want to dwell on the past trends data, but I just thought it's worth clarifying that the past trends data that's been talked about today, where York has performed very strongly, is really York with the brakes on. When you consider how constrained the supply of office space has been over the past 10 years. I'm sure we're going to come on to discuss it in a second, but York has lost a huge amount of office space. Just by the council's own figures, 42,000 square metres of office space since 2017, but if you go back further to 2013, it's over 70,000 square metres. The vacancy rate has been permanently below 2%. So, and when we were doing, for background, Hatch, the company that I work for, led the Leeds City Region Strategic Employment Land Study last year, which included York. And York was by far and away the most constrained office market. At the time, it had a vacancy rate of close to 0%. We spoke to a number of agents back then who said this is definitely acting as a constraint on investment and a constraint on business growth. So the past trends that we've talked about really is a kind of, I suppose, the kind of the bare minimum. York could have achieved a lot more if there hadn't been these constraints in place. So we shouldn't be projecting those constraints into the future when thinking about the overall employment land requirement.
Thank you. Mr. Linus, do you want to address that, or your colleague?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that really highlights the... of course, we're focusing on policy EC1, but policy EC2 is about protecting our existing employment land in York. That's really important to us. I think, those vacancy rates are a matter of fact. There is strong demand, and if the question was, if we could build as many offices as we liked in York, how many of them we could fill, you'd have a very different answer to the question that we've asked, which is actually to meet the aspirations that the city has in terms of economic growth, and to meet the policies that we've set out in the plan, in the economic strategy. What does that mean in terms of growth? Is a different question from if you completely removed any restrictions, how much office space could you fit into York? There is a massive demand for York because it's a very popular place for people to live and for businesses to be based. And that means that to some extent the businesses that come to York are self-selecting in terms of those that can find and afford the space that there is here. I don't think anyone would question that. But what we have done as a starting point for our economic strategy, and therefore what we talk about in the plan, is we've looked at what is our actual ambition to grow. What's our ambition as a city, both in terms of the business community, but also the broader community. And that's been resolved into what I've described as in the economic strategy. And then we've used that then to say, well, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of, if those are the agreed ambitions of our city, what does that mean in terms of the amount of employment land that we need to provide for some of that growth, bearing in mind that we also need to keep our existing employment land as employment land. And I think really strengthening what we do to protect existing land, employment land in the city is really important, because a consequence of, as you've described, the loss of office space through permitted development is really significant. And that's why I'm consistently making comments on applications for change of use from office into other uses, and saying, actually, no, we can't do that. And we've got to, we don't at the moment have all the tools that we need really to be able to protect what we have as much as we can. I think we need to, that's something that we need to do more of in the future.
And that is, of course, reflected in policy EC2, which sets out the requirements to retain where appropriate existing employment land. And that's important in addition to those allocations in terms of our supply response.
Another point I would add, sir, is that the loss of office space has actually been taken into account in the update table 4.1 as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm slightly concerned about the progress that we aren't making. I think, though, that our discussion on 3.1 is probably coming to an end. So if I hear from Mr. Goldston and then Mr. Corsia, and then we'll look, I think, to move on to, well, we're going to take a suite of issues together as one, actually. But, yeah.
I think we can probably come on to my points in the next question. If you want to move the conversation on, that's fine. I'll raise them shortly.
As long as you're not going to move it back. Grateful, thank you. Mr. Corsia.
I'm sorry, sir, to come back, but one of the problems of me going first is that the discussion moves on from your points. Can I just take you back to figures, sir? And I don't really want to bore you with this, but there you have various figures, ONS, job creation job figures. You have Oxford Economics, and you have NOMIS. All are different because of the way they interpret, how They're all different, sir. But what they all show, sir, is that between 2012, which is obviously as we emerged out of the recession, to 2017, a relatively fast rate of growth in York, and from 2017 to 2020, or 2019, whatever figure you want to use, a much slower rate of growth. And so on the figures, if from 2017 to 2019, sir, can I just take you to the Council's own document, which is CYC 29. You have the 2017 figure, sir, of 119,531. You turn back a page, sir.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kersey, what was the page number?
It's the 2017 119,531. And that's figure 14, sir. Figure 14, page 20. That's the base, sir, they're projecting from. You then look on figure 13. I'm sorry we're going backwards, but that's just the way the document's laid out. You have years where data is now available, and you see a figure of 119,000 again. 2018. And then you see years of forecasts, 119,000 again. So based on what Oxford Economics are telling you, there hasn't been this massive growth in employment. And neither does NOMIS, neither does the ONS show that. And so can I just deal with the nature of these projections? What, is the university included or not included? So by the very nature of these projections, they are based upon national and regional trends, which are then applied to a local area. They don't take into account local factors. And it's not unusual for a major employer such as university to say, yes, we're going to produce lots more jobs than you have put in the sectoral forecast. But equally, sir, we know in York there is going to be a sector which is going to massively lose jobs, which is the Army, sir, which is a massive employer in York, which is going to close all their bases in York in the planned period. And that probably will, and that isn't taken into account in any way in these forecasts, because that's not the way the forecasts work. So, sir, the forecasts are, you can't actually apply the forecast in this way, which the university are saying. We take the 650 plus our growth on top of that. And so what the plan actually does, and I think in terms of land requirements, is it actually produces land for 650 jobs and then puts an additional allocation for the university, which is on top of the 650 jobs land requirement. But I also go back. What is the purpose of this aspirational figure? Why is York actually trying to achieve 650 jobs per annum, or indeed a higher figure? We know, sir, it's not to reduce the quantum of jobs, isn't for the existing population of York. What the existing population of York needs is higher value jobs, not more jobs. And so what we do know is that there are very severe environmental effects, including upon the essential setting. And so I would draw you all to the multiple references in the plan that how the heritage and setting of York is the main driver of its economic development. So what, in fact, it's a little bit like a man cutting off his own leg to achieve a bit more height. I don't know, I'm not very good. But you understand the point, sir?
I did before you used the analogy.
I'm sorry for the analogy, sir. I got my analogy mixed up. So I don't know whether you want me to do, so I'm in your hands, the essay of the 650 dwellings. Do you want me to deal with that now or not?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Do you want me to deal with the essay of the 650 jobs or not, the adequacy of that essay? And I'm entirely in your hands. I can do that in writing if you wish. It may be easier to do it in writing.
Yeah, did we not agree yesterday that we would, well, you had homework, didn't you?
I did, sir. Except obviously this is the detail, part of the detail process, but it's probably one of those boring things that are better done in writing, to be honest, than done.
Are you content with that, Mr. Linus?
We're content, and we'll make sure we mention the word boring in our reply. Content to deal with that in writing, sir, yes.
I think that's probably the better way to do it, yeah. If everyone's content.
I'm happy with that, sir.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Coursier.
Sir, just on the other points Mr. Coursier made, I don't think I've got anything to add on what he said about the university, and insofar as he's raising points about potentially, say, environmental implications of a 650 jobs growth target / requirement, whichever approach is taken to it. It's not really for this session. It's about the implications of that in other forms of the planning policy. It's in the plan. That would be the appropriate time to debate it. So we don't need to add anything more to that.
I should have added that I am acting for a parish council in which the university is cited. We do take issue with quite a lot of the comments made, well, some of the comments made by the Vice-Chancellor, but I think we would deal with that under the site-specific.
Yes.
Just because it's not challenged now doesn't mean we accept them.
No, that's noted from the council's part, sir. We understand your position on that, but today's not the time to do it.
Good. Shall we'll move the discussion on to the next batch of questions then.
Yeah, so we're going to take issues 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 and 3.5 together.
I'll come to you first, Mr. Linus, then.
Okay, the 650 jobs target was converted into floor space demand, and we can go into the detailed mechanics if you wish to of how that was done. The demand generated was reflected in table 4.1. Now in updated hearing statement 3 as table 1. Update to 4.1 with the loss of employment floor space that has been cited. Now, table 4.1 has informed, but it does not dictate or strictly define the supply response that you see in policy EC1. Instead, the site allocations respond to these broad demand projections, but they're also informed by certain adjustments. So firstly, the adjustment built into that demand table to provide flexibility in supply. So looking at a 5% vacancy rate and providing 2 years additional supply. And that was initially in response to, at the time of the 2016 Employment Land Review, so SD 064, the already in place permitted development rights and the potential impact of those. It was also informed by market signals. We touched on this very briefly earlier. The 4.1 table doesn't generate any need for B2 industrial floor space, for example. However, the policy EC1 schedule does include B2 floor space, and that's to allow for choice and churn. So we are responding to market signals in that respect, and also to the consultation, quite extensive consultation and engagement that we've had with stakeholders across the city. And the need to deal with that choice and churn is very explicitly dealt with in SD 063, the Employment Land Update, and I would point you to paragraph 3.10 in particular. that engagement with stakeholders, and while there is a debate to be had, which we've touched on around the site-specific issues in terms of the university's allocation ST27, also led to the allocation of that site to provide for university uses and knowledge business uses as set out in the policy. So 4.1 has informed the supply response, but not rigidly dictated it. And I would also add that EC1 works with EC2, which is very much about protecting that existing supply where it's appropriate to do so. Okay, with respect to the 650 figure and whether the plan sets out the supply, the EC1 policy sets out site allocations with capacity to deliver 239,222 square metres of new employment floor space, plus the university site. But as set out in our hearing statement in response to question 3.3, that's part of the strategy, the supply response. We're also looking at that existing floor space under policy EC2 and other policies in the plan which provide an enabling framework for the delivery of employment generating uses outside of strictly office or industrial settings. As to whether the detail in 4.1 should be set out as an explicit target in the plan, I don't think so, for the reasons that I've explained, in that it is one input into the supply response that has been defined in policy EC1.
Who would like to lead off on this set of questions? Ms. Cook, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I have in front of me SDO 63, the September 27 update. And I'm going to invite you to, if you can, get to that and look at table 6, which was the derivation of table 4.1 in the local plan. It's on page 8 for those with a paper version.
Sorry, Ms. Cook, what was that page number?
The page number is page 8.
8, okay.
Page 8 of the September 2017 Employment Land Update, SDO 63. And you can see there the title, Employment Land Requirement, and the reference to the fact that it includes the 5% vacancy, and it factors in what has happened between 2012 and 2017, and it also factors in this additional extra 2 years, which is additional flexibility which the council have already just referred you to. Looking at the, so just have that, as it were, in your mind, because as I understand it from the text in the local plan and also from the table 4.1 in the plan, it's effectively this table. And now we seem to be in a situation where we are given a new update to this, and we can see that the B1A office space figure has grown considerably. And that's because Central York has been granted a planning permission. And what's happening, it seems, is that this table is beginning to look as if it's a combination of requirement and supply. I'm concerned that there's a bit of a fudging of the two things. And it's made more difficult because whereas before, in the 2017 update, there was a table 4. If you go to page 5, if you just scroll back, you'll see that explained what had happened between 2012 and 2017. I haven't got a similar update. We haven't got a similar update in front of us. And the other thing that you might like to invite the council to do, just to test the 650 average jobs, is to use some average density figures to ask themselves how many jobs, 137,000, for example, just focus on the B1A. How many jobs would that throw up over the planned period? I think it's going to throw up thousands of jobs, way more than 650. Which just brings me back to the dangers of the 650 for tomorrow's session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Linus.
Sir, others may correct me, but the understanding of table 4.1, certainly is my understanding, was it allowed for the loss of office floor space, 42,000 square metres identified in the hearing statement. So we don't think there's been any sort of mixing.
My apologies, Mr. Linus.
Sorry,
I can't hear you.
My fault. We don't think there's been any mixing in the way that's been suggested. It's allowing for a loss of office floor space, but I can ask others to confirm that. And I'll ask officers if they deal with the other point about the 137,000, please.
Yeah, so the reduction is to do with changes in permitted development. So off the top of my head, I think it's the former Yorkshire General Insurance building that was now the Malmaison Hotel, and possibly Stonebow House, which is now residential. So there are some significant office blocks were lost in that period, and we've adjusted the figures because of that. There was already an allocation within the underlying model, which included change of use, but we've just added those in as well. In terms of the 130, I mean, the land use that is essentially produced as through the model is based on the figures we've been talking about that also derive the 650. So, as I said, the process we've gone through is we've taken the change in different sectors over the planned period. We've looked at what that means in terms of, first of all, how does that fit sectorially? And then we've done an FTE calculation in terms of the change in FTEs in each sector. We've then applied that to typical planning uses for those sectors. And then we've turned those then into actual requirements for for space by applying standard multipliers in terms of square metres per job. So the 137,000 figure that's been mentioned, as I say, derives from that same forecast that produces the 650 figure. They're intrinsically linked. They're not two separate calculations. We've then adjusted in terms of the update for what additional changes of use have been factored in.
Ms Cook, did you want to come back on that?
So my point was that there's been, even though if you just look at the column headed 2021 to 2033 in the updated table in the council statement, that 137588, and you compare that with the table 6 in the employment land study, which is looking at a longer period because it's looking at 2017 to 2033. So I've got a shorter period, but I've got a growth in the floor space. And I think that the difference between, my understanding of the difference between these two is that someone somewhere has asked themselves what has happened in terms of gains and losses between 2017 and 2021. This is my missing table 4. And York Central's been granted permission. And that's why the floor space figures have gone up. That's why I'd like you to get the council to do this reconciliation with using HCA densities and just see how many thousands of jobs they are in fact planning for without really telling you.
Go on.
So table 4.1, as updated, has simply been updated with the loss of employment floor space. So the figures that went into generating the jobs target remain the same. So it's a supply change, not a demand for employment floor space change. We're adjusting that to reflect the loss of employment floor space.
Can you just explain that in a little more detail, perhaps? The differences between the table that's in the submitted plan that I've got in front of me and what's in your hearing statement. Sorry.
So the table that's in the plan is from the Employment Land Review 2017. That's SD 064. The table SD 064, the 2017 plan itself updates the data from the 2016 assessment of what the 650 jobs growth projection looked like in terms of the demand for different types of employment space. What the 2017 table, now reflected in the local plan, and the update in the hearing statement do is simply adjust those figures for loss in supply.
And is that the sole difference? It's just the change in the supply?
Yes, sir.
Did you want to add anything? I'm content with that. Ms Cook, was there anything else?
I don't think so. So, I mean, I think you will just have to look at the Employment Land Review update and look and see how Table 4 in that table is an input, as I had understood it, into Table 6. And that is looking at not only losses, but it's also looking at gains. And I'm struggling to understand why the council is apparently saying that they've adopted a different approach in producing this updated table 4.1.
Was there anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so. So I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand the way the point's being put to Ms Cook, in the sense that, as Mr Bereson's explained, the earlier work was derived from the 650 figure, which then produced table 4.1, and what you see in the update to table 4.1 is an amendment to effectively take into account loss of office space, and that's reflected in the requirements. So we're not sure that the exercise Ms Cook is inviting you to carry out is a proper reflection of the way the council sought to reach the figures in table 4.1, because we've taken the 650, translated that into a floor space requirement going through the steps Mr Bereson identified, and then we have updated that in the new table 4.1 to allow for the loss of office floor space in particular. So we don't think that the calculation that we're being invited to carry out by Ms Cook is actually properly understanding the process that's been followed in reaching table 4.1, either as originally published or as currently proposed. And I think, just as I understand it, the idea about focusing on the loss of office spaces is to make sure that, insofar as we're using table 4.1 to identify supply requirements, that it's robust, because we're allowing for the maximum losses of spaces.
Yeah, so it tends to answer the question, oh, hang on a second, we've got this allocation, but we've got these permitted developments going on as well. Does that mean we need to change the allocation? And that's what the table is designed. It shows you then, actually, no, we're okay within the allocations that we've already made. It certainly doesn't have any relevance at all to the York Central planning application. It simply recognises that there have been significant permitted development changes of use, which obviously we hadn't allowed for when we were putting the plan together originally. Does that then change the quantum of space that's needed? It's not about, has that changed the forecast number of jobs being created? It's about, has that reduction in the supply actually meant that actually we need to provide more? And our analysis is, no, actually we're still okay.
Is supply related, not what Ms Cook is saying, and somehow reversing it back into a higher jobs growth requirement?
Sorry, can I just try and explain based on my interpretation of it, because there is two different things going on here. There's the future demand, and there's the need to replace existing floor space. Now, I suppose if you wanted to relate it back to jobs, implicit in this kind of assumption is that the need to replace all of the office space that's been lost, say over the past 7 years, you're assuming that there's been jobs losses as a result of that. So this is just to replace those. This is just to basically to get you back to zero. The need to replace office space is just to get you back to zero. So although you could say if you applied jobs densities to 137,000 square meters, that would give you a much larger jobs figure. But implicit in that is the assumption that lots of those jobs have gone because there's been so much lost office space. So we need to replace the space so that we can kind of bring those jobs back almost. So I think that's what's going on here. But I think the main, I suppose, issue that this raises is that there has been a huge increase in the amount of replacement office space needed, and that could potentially continue to increase. So what isn't clear from this table is whether there are any unimplemented permissions for further losses of office space. Maybe the council could clarify that. But also the risk of future losses in the future, which could further kind of make it even harder to achieve the targets that the council has set for itself, because at the moment, York is losing more office space than it's building, and that's been the case for some time. So there is a really need to consider what's going to be done to address that, and whether the local plan needs to build in an assumption that there will be further losses of office space. So we will need to replace those in the future, because like I said earlier, the vacancy rate in York is rock bottom. So any office space which is lost, it's a pretty safe assumption that jobs are going to be displaced. So you do need to replace any further losses. And at the moment, it's not clear what's being assumed about those future losses. And then my last point is just really what this says about the total demand for office space, which is now close to 150,000 square metres over the period to 2038, and whether there's adequate supply to meet that demand. But that's a later question that we'll come back to.
Mr. Linus?
Just a couple of brief points, and then others may add others. One point to note, as we mentioned already, but the figures in Table 4, both in its original and amended form, as we've mentioned, allow for 2 years extra supply. Again, it's another illustration of the flexibility that's been built into the
My apologies,
figures.
Mr. Linus, I missed the point.
Sorry, sir. I need to get closer to my mic again. As we've explained, and as we can detail further, there's already flexibility of supply built into the table, because we've allowed for an extra 2 years' worth within the supply calculations that we're putting forward. The second point in response to future losses of offices is not only the flexibility point I just mentioned, but as we've referred to already, EC1 needs to be seen in the context of a wider strategy relating to employment land within the plan, including policy to protect existing office space. And the hearing statement already refers to the Council looking at other means to try and control the loss of office space, Article 4 directions and so on. So one can't relate this issue about the loss of office space purely to what the figures are in Table 4.1. There's a broader strategy in play to deal with that. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I'm maybe being a little bit slow, in which case forgive me. But the point about flexibility built in the table, could you just explain that to me?
So in arriving at Table 4.1 in its original form, Employment Land Review 2016, we provided an adjustment above the calculation made to provide flexibility in supply, so providing for a 5% vacancy rate and adding additional 2 years of supply. So that's on top of what the calculation, which we can expand on if you require us to, generated.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Sorry, could you just explain this additional 2 years of... Okay, I understand you've added 5% for vacancies. Can you just explain this additional 2 years to me?
So in SDO 63, the City of York Employment Land Review update.
Yeah, that table there is the same as in the plan, isn't it? As originally submitted.
Yes,
yeah.
And at paragraph 3.2, we've reflect the extended plan period to add an additional 2 years of supply to that existing calculation.
to take it from
No,
2031
I'm just not getting that. Where have you done that?
Paragraph 3.2, SDO 63, that's the 2017 Employment Land Review update.
So rather than being for the period to 2031, that is for the period to 2033, and that's been essentially, I believe, we've added 2 years pro rata onto the total to allow for those extra 2 years.
So in the plan, that table 4.1 in the plan as originally submitted, which is the same, isn't it, as the table? I've forgotten what number it's got in the Employment Land Review update, table 6, isn't it? So where I see, for example, the column that relates to 2017 to 2033, you've got floor space and land figures there. In reality, are you saying that you have embedded within those figures an additional